The moment my father shouted across the chapel, time froze. Grandma's casket lay between them like a final battlefield. "You should be lying here instead," he hissed at my grandfather, his voice echoing off the stained glass windows. Every mourner stared, some in shock, others pretending not to hear. But Grandpa didn't flinch. He rose, buttoned his navy suit, and looked at my father with eyes that had seen too much war, too much family decay. "I'd rather do something else," he said quietly. Then he walked out past the casket, past the whispers, straight into the rain. 30 minutes later, my father's phone started buzzing over and over. 47 missed calls. When we finally found out what Grandpa had done, the whole town was talking. And I learned that day that sometimes the one who walks away from a funeral isn't escaping death, but delivering justice. The chapel smelled like lilies and wet wood, that strange mix of grief and polish that clung to every funeral I'd ever been to. Grandma Ruth's picture sat at the front, her smile gentle, eyes alive in a way that hurt to look at. I stood between my father, Michael, and my grandfather, Thomas Hayes, both men carved from the same mold but separated by something colder than time: resentment. Dad's jaw twitched as the pastor spoke about forgiveness. "Forgiveness," he muttered under his breath, "is for people who deserve it." When the service ended, people began filing out, whispering condolences. Then Dad stepped forward, right up to Grandpa. His voice cracked through the quiet. "You should be lying here instead. You killed her, you stubborn old man." The room fell silent. Even the organist froze mid-note. Grandpa's eyes lifted slowly, not angry, just tired. "Grief makes sons cruel," he said softly. "But I forgive you." Dad laughed bitterly. "Forgive me? For what? Telling the truth?" I wanted to pull him back, to make it stop, but I couldn't move. Everyone watched as Grandpa adjusted his tie and turned toward the door. "I'd rather do something else," he murmured. Then he walked out. The sound of the church door closing was sharper than thunder. For a moment no one spoke. Then the whispers began: neighbors, cousins, people pretending not to stare. Dad stood trembling, his hands balled into fists. He looked at me and snapped, "Don't you dare follow him." But I did. Outside, the rain had started. Grandpa's car, a faded blue Lincoln, was gone. I stood in the parking lot, soaked, watching taillights disappear down the road. Something in my chest sank, like I'd just witnessed the beginning of an earthquake. 30 minutes later, we were back at the house, guests trickling in for the wake. Dad paced the living room, muttering, checking his phone every few seconds. Then it rang once, twice, then dozens of times. By the time he picked it up, the screen read 47 missed calls. He played the voicemail on speaker. Grandpa's voice filled the room, steady, measured, almost cold. "Michael, I told you one day the truth would bury itself. I just chose the time. You'll understand soon." Dad went pale. "What does that mean?" No one answered. I looked through the rain-streaked window toward the dark road that led out of town, wondering where he'd gone. Something told me this wasn't about grief anymore. It was about payback, carefully planned, long overdue. That was the last time any of us saw Grandpa Thomas alive in public. But it was the first time I realized he hadn't left to mourn. He'd left to finish something he started long before my father ever shouted those words at the funeral. The night after the funeral didn't feel like mourning, it felt like waiting for an explosion. Dad didn't eat, didn't speak, just sat in Grandma's armchair staring at his phone. The house was too quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional vibration from another call that he refused to answer. By midnight, I couldn't stand it anymore. "Dad," I whispered, "maybe we should call the police." He slammed his palm against the table. "He's not missing, Emily. He's hiding. He always hides when he's guilty." "Guilty of what?" I wanted to ask, but the look on his face told me the question would cost me something I wasn't ready to lose. The next morning, sunlight spilled across Grandma's kitchen, catching dust motes in the air. Something shimmered on the counter, a small silver music box, the one Grandma used to wind every Sunday afternoon. It was open. The melody had long stopped, but inside lay something strange. A brass key and an old black-and-white photograph of Grandpa standing outside the county courthouse. On the back of the photo, in his neat handwriting, were 6 words: "The truth belongs in daylight, th." I showed Dad. His expression flickered, fear first, then anger. "He's taunting me," he muttered. "He knows exactly what he's doing." "What does this key open?" I asked. He hesitated before answering. It looks like a bank key. We drove to First Gulf Savings, the small bank our family had used for decades. The teller recognized us immediately. Mr. Hayes left instructions, she said nervously, disappearing into the back. When she returned, she carried a small steel box. He said this could only be opened by both of you. My father's hands shook as he turned the key. Inside were three things: a sealed envelope labeled Hayes Family Foundation, transfer notice, a USB flash drive, a folded letter with my name on it. Dad snatched the flash drive before I could touch it. Whatever this is, it's mine. But I held on to the letter. Grandpa's handwriting covered a single sheet. Emily, when truth surfaces, love sinks first. Don't let it drown you. Watch Noon News tomorrow. Grandpa. When we returned home, Dad plugged in the USB to his laptop. His face drained of color as spreadsheets and scanned documents filled the screen: court records, financial statements, and his own signature. He slammed the laptop shut. This is fake. He's framing me. But deep down, I saw something flicker in his eyes. Recognition. I unfolded Grandpa's letter again, the ink slightly smudged by my thumb. Noon tomorrow. I didn't know what kind of storm was coming, but I knew my grandfather wasn't running away. He was about to drag the entire Hayes family into the light. The next morning, I barely slept. Dad sat at the dining table, surrounded by papers, mumbling to himself like a man cornered by ghosts. His laptop was open again. Every few seconds, he'd scroll through the files on that USB bank transfers, county documents, foundation ledgers, each stamped with his name and electronic signature. None of this makes sense, he said, his voice cracking. He must have doctored these. Grandpa was a judge, I reminded him softly. He knew what evidence looks like. Dad's head snapped up. Whose side are you on, Emily? The question hit harder than I expected. I wanted to say no one's. But that wasn't true. A part of me already knew whose side I was, on the one that wasn't afraid of the truth. At exactly noon, Grandpa's words came to life. Every TV channel in town interrupted regular programming. Breaking news: county fraud investigation launched into misused hospice and charity funds. Dad froze. My breath caught in my throat. The news anchor continued. According to court documents filed anonymously, over $1.2 million in hospice donations were redirected through private accounts tied to Michael Hayes, financial manager for the county hospital. I turned to him. Dad. He slammed his fist on the table so hard the coffee mug shattered. He set me up. That bitter old man, he wanted to humiliate me. But those accounts, they exist, don't they? I asked quietly. He didn't answer. He just stared at the floor, his breathing heavy. A knock came at the door. Two men in suits stood outside detectives. They asked for Mr. Michael Hayes. Dad's shoulders slumped. I'd never seen him look small before. As they questioned him, my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Don't defend him, Emily. The truth will need you later. T.H. That was the last time Grandpa contacted me. By evening, the entire town was whispering. The local paper ran the headline: Former judge's whistleblower tip exposes massive charity fraud. It is not provides pasting. Neighbors pretended not to stare when I passed them. My mother locked herself in the bedroom, crying quietly. Dad's lawyer arrived late that night, his tie crooked, his voice low. Michael, it's bad. He didn't just file evidence, he filed it perfectly. Every date, every transaction, every witness lined up. Whoever did this knew the system inside out. Of course he did. Grandpa had spent 40 years inside that system. I went upstairs to my room, clutching Grandpa's letter. The truth belongs in daylight, he had written. For years, I thought justice was something that happened in courtrooms. But that night, I realized it starts somewhere else, in the courage to burn down the lies your family built. And my grandfather had just lit the match. For 3 days after the news broke, silence filled our house like fog. No one wanted to speak, but the weight of what wasn't said pressed on every wall. Mom avoided Dad. Dad avoided me. And I avoided the truth until the doorbell rang. Standing there was Eleanor Brooks, a sharp-eyed woman in a gray blazer. Emily Hayes? She asked. Her voice was calm, clipped, professional, the kind of tone that makes people tell the truth. Yes, do I know you? I was your grandfather's attorney. He asked me to meet you in case things went exactly as they have. Dad appeared behind me instantly. Get out, he growled. You're part of this circus. Eleanor didn't even flinch. Mr. Hayes, if you want to stay out of prison, you might want to listen to what your father left behind. That silenced him. We sat in the living room where Grandma's flowers still wilted in vases. Eleanor opened a folder thick with documents. 2 weeks before Ruth's death, Thomas delivered these to my office sealed affidavits, bank ledgers, and witness statements. He anticipated resistance from you, Dad snorted. Of course he did. He never trusted anyone. Eleanor looked up. He trusted justice. That's why he did this through me legally, irrevocably. She turned to me. He also left something specifically for you. She slid a small digital recorder across the table. A yellow label on it read, "Confession is not equal to redemption." I pressed play. The static crackled, and then I heard Grandpa's voice, tired but steady. Emily, if you're hearing this, it means I've chosen the truth over peace. Years ago, I covered for your father. I told myself it was mercy, but it was cowardice. Ruth knew. It destroyed her health faster than the cancer ever could. When she whispered forgiveness, I realized forgiveness without truth is rot. This time, I won't hide him from his own choices. Dad stood abruptly, his chair screeching. Turn it off! He's manipulating you. I stopped the recording. Dad, he said Grandma knew. He looked like I'd hit him. For a moment, I saw guilt, real, raw, unfiltered, flash behind his eyes. Your grandmother was dying. He poisoned her last days with his lectures. Eleanor's tone remained clinical. She died knowing the money meant for hospice beds had gone to luxury investments. She signed a statement before passing that's part of the evidence. Dad's breathing quickened. You think you can take everything from me? Eleanor gathered her papers calmly. Your father already did, and he left instructions for the foundation to reclaim every cent. When she left, the house felt smaller. Dad poured whiskey into a glass and stared at the floor. He always had to win, he muttered. I didn't answer. I was still hearing Grandpa's voice, forgiveness without truth is rot. Later that night, I drove out to the lakeside cabin Grandpa had loved, the one we'd spent summers fishing at when I was little. The porch light was off, but the door was unlocked. Inside, the air smelled like cedar and dust. His old law books were still on the shelf. On the kitchen table sat a single note. If they curse me, let them. You cannot heal in the dark. I sat there for a long time, listening to the waves against the dock. I realized Grandpa hadn't betrayed his family, he'd just refused to lie for them anymore. The next morning, the police came with warrants. The investigation was now official. And for the first time, I understood what legacy meant. Not what you leave behind, but what truth you refuse to bury. 2 days after Eleanor's visit, the house didn't feel like a home anymore. It felt like a waiting room before a verdict. The blinds were shut, the phones kept ringing, and every ring tightened the air like a noose. When Dad's bail was set, he came home silent. But silence from him was worse than shouting. It carried shame, anger, and something else I hadn't seen before, fear. That night, as rain hit the windows, I walked downstairs. He sat in the dark, whiskey glass half empty, staring at Grandpa's framed photo. You think he's some kind of hero? He said, without looking at me. He humiliated me in front of everyone. My own father. He didn't humiliate you, I said softly. He warned you, and you didn't listen. He laughed bitter and hollow. Warned me? He destroyed me. You think this is justice? I stepped closer. What's justice then? Letting you steal from dying patients so you can keep pretending we're a good family? He slammed the glass down so hard it shattered. You know nothing about what he did to me. I froze. He stood up, pacing like a trapped animal. You were too young to remember, Emily. When I lost my business in 2008, he could have helped me. He had money, savings, investments, power. But you know what he said? His voice cracked. If you want to build something, build it honestly. Honest doesn't pay the mortgage. Honest doesn't save your wife's hospital bills. My voice trembled. So you fixed that by stealing hospice donations? From people who were dying, Dad? He turned away, gripping his hair. I didn't steal. I borrowed. I just lost track. Things got mixed. One payment became 2, then 10. And suddenly I couldn't stop. I was going to fix it before he what? Before he exposed you? The lightning flashed outside, white and violent. His eyes glistened, but not from remorse, from fury. He always wanted to make me look small. Even at the end, he couldn't let me breathe without his judgment. I swallowed hard. He didn't want you to look small, Dad. He wanted you to look in the mirror. He slammed his hand on the table, the sound echoing through the house. Enough! But I couldn't stop now. My voice broke into a sob. Mom knew, didn't she? That's why Grandma couldn't forgive you. That's why she got worse. The stress, the guilt. Stop it. She begged you to stop, didn't she? Dad's eyes filled with tears, the kind you hate seeing because they make you remember that even the monsters you fear were once human. He sank into the chair, head in his hands. She begged me, he whispered. Said I was killing her. And maybe I was. But I couldn't crawl back to him, Emily. I couldn't let Thomas Hayes watch me fail again. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel anger. I felt pity. My father, proud, furious, broken, was still that little boy begging his father to say, I'm proud of you. I took a breath. Then stop the cycle. Admit what you did. Before it kills you too. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot. You sound just like him. Maybe that's not a bad thing. The front door opened suddenly. A cold draft swept in. Eleanor Brooks stood there, soaked from the rain. Emily, I need to speak with you. Privately, Dad barked. Not another word in my house. Eleanor ignored him. Thomas Hayes is at St. Joseph's Hospital. Heart complications. He's asking for you. My breath caught. Me? He refuses anyone else. I didn't even grab my coat. The hospital smelled like disinfectant and endings. Machines beeped softly in rhythm with my heartbeat. Grandpa looked impossibly small in the bed, oxygen tubes tracing his face like fragile wires, but his eyes, sharp, clear, unbroken, met mine. You came, he rasped. Of course I came, I said, trying not to cry. He smiled weakly. Good. Your father? At home, I said. Drinking. Angry. His nod was almost imperceptible. So he's alive enough to hate me. That's something. I sat beside him, clutching his frail hand. You knew this would happen, didn't you? You knew he'd hate you for it. He closed his eyes, exhaled slowly. I knew I'd lose him either way. But at least this way, I lose him to truth, not rot. Tears blurred my vision. You destroyed your own son. No, he whispered. I freed him from pretending to be good. I shook my head. You could have just talked to him. He smiled faintly. I tried for 40 years. Sometimes silence answers better than words. Then he turned to his bedside drawer, trembling fingers pulling out a sealed envelope. This is for you. I opened it, property deed, Hayes Lakeside Cabin. Signed over to my name. Why? I asked, voice cracking. So you'll have something untainted. Build something new. He squeezed my hand weakly. Don't let his bitterness bury you too. I started to speak, but the heart monitor screamed a shrill, mechanical cry. Nurses rushed in. I was pushed aside, helpless. Stay with me, Grandpa. Flatline. And just like that, Thomas Hayes, the man who'd torn his family apart to rebuild its soul, was gone. In the hallway, I stood drenched in tears, watching the light above his room flicker from yellow to red. Somewhere deep inside, I knew this wasn't the end. It was the moment everything truth, guilt, and blood would finally collide. The morning of the will reading felt surreal. Rain tapped softly against the courthouse windows, the same kind of rain that had fallen on Grandma's funeral. Maybe it was poetic justice, the sky mourning one last time for a family that had torn itself apart. We gathered in a mahogany-paneled office downtown. The air smelled of paper and polish, the kind of scent that comes with finality. Dad sat across the table from me, pale, sleepless, his hands trembling on the armrest. His lawyer whispered something in his ear, but he wasn't really listening. Eleanor Brooks entered with a leather folder. This is the last will and testament of Thomas Henry Hayes, she announced. Her voice was steady, almost ceremonial, every word cut like a scalpel. To my son, Michael Hayes, I leave forgiveness but no inheritance. A man must build his own fortune if he wishes to value it. Dad's face went white. He gripped the chair so tightly I thought it might snap. To my granddaughter, Emily Hayes, I leave the lakeside cabin, as a reminder that peace is something one must maintain, not inherit. I felt everyone's eyes turn toward me. I didn't want the cabin not like this. But it wasn't about property. It was a message. Eleanor continued, her tone softening slightly. The remainder of my estate, including financial assets, investments, and real property, shall fund the Ruth Hayes Hospice Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to providing end-of-life care for families in need. The foundation shall be co-managed by Emily Hayes, under legal counsel of Brooks and Mason Law. For a long time, no one spoke. The only sound was the slow ticking of a wall clock, counting down to the moment my father finally snapped. He stood, voice trembling but venomous. He gave you everything. Everything I worked for. You think this is justice? I met his eyes. They were wild, desperate, not angry anymore, just lost. He didn't give it to me, Dad, I said quietly. He gave it to Mom, to every mother who died waiting for the care she deserved. He stared at me, stunned as if the thought had never occurred to him. His lips parted, but no words came out. Eleanor slid a final page across the table. There's one more clause. Mr. Hayes stipulated that all misappropriated funds from his son's accounts will be reclaimed through the Foundation's restitution fund. Voluntary cooperation is advised. Dad sank back into his chair, deflated. His lawyer whispered something again, but he didn't react. He just whispered under his breath. He won. I wanted to tell him it wasn't about winning, but the truth was, it was. Grandpa had beaten him, not out of spite, but out of love twisted into something sharper. Accountability. When the session ended, Eleanor handed me a folder with my name embossed in gold. Director, Ruth Hayes Hospice Foundation. Outside, the rain had stopped. The sun broke through the clouds in thin, trembling beams. For the first time in weeks, I let myself breathe. Grandpa had taken everything, money, pride, illusions, and turned them into something that might finally heal what he couldn't fix in life. And whether my father saw it or not, this was his redemption written in legal ink. 3 months later, the courthouse felt different. Not cold, not intimidating, just inevitable. The local paper called it the Hayes case, a family divided by justice. Everyone in town knew the story now, how the retired judge exposed his own son, how the granddaughter became the unexpected heir. I walked through the marble hallway in a navy suit that didn't quite feel like mine. The press cameras clicked like insects. Dad was already there, seated beside his attorney. He looked smaller than I remembered, the kind of small that doesn't come from age but from exhaustion. When the bailiff called his name, Michael Hayes versus the state of Florida, my stomach twisted. He rose slowly, the same way Grandpa had at Grandma's funeral, except this time, there was no strength behind it. The prosecutor outlined everything: embezzlement, falsified ledgers, charity fraud. Each charge sounded less like a legal term and more like an obituary for the man I'd once called my hero. I kept my eyes on the floor, but when they called me to the stand, I felt every eye in the room shift toward me. Miss Hayes, the prosecutor began gently, did your grandfather ever discuss these allegations with you before his passing? Yes, I said, voice trembling but firm. He told me he wasn't protecting our name anymore. He said, a good name means nothing if it hides a bad truth. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Then came the defense. Dad's lawyer painted a portrait of desperation, a man trying to support his dying mother, pressured by a perfectionist father. I almost pitied him, until I remembered the hospice records, the missing donations, the patients who'd never received care. When it was his turn to speak, Dad looked at me instead of the judge. I didn't want to hurt anyone, he said, voice breaking. I just wanted him to see I wasn't a failure. For the first time, he sounded human again, not cruel, not defensive, just broken. The judge, a stern woman with gray hair and steady eyes, read her verdict slowly. Michael Hayes, this court acknowledges your cooperation and the restitution through the Ruth Hayes Foundation. However, no measure of charity undoes betrayal. You are hereby sentenced to 5 years probation, full financial restitution, and permanent removal from public office. The gavel struck once, a clean, final sound. As people began to stand, I realized I was crying. Not for punishment, but for release. The cycle was finally breaking. Outside, reporters swarmed. One shouted, Emily, how do you feel about your grandfather's actions? I wiped my eyes, met the cameras, and said, he didn't destroy our family. He disinfected it. For a moment there was silence, then flashes erupted, recording every word. I turned toward the courthouse steps, the same sun spilling over me that had shone on Grandpa's funeral. And for the first time in my life, the name Hayes didn't feel like a curse. It felt like truth cleansed, scarred, but finally honest. A year later, the garden around Grandma's grave bloomed brighter than I'd ever seen it. The roses, the same ivory kind she used to plant every spring, swayed gently under the late afternoon wind. Beside her headstone now rested another simple granite. No flourish, no epitaph beyond his name. Thomas Henry Hayes, the truth belongs in daylight. I knelt between them, brushing fallen petals from the soil. "You did it, Grandpa," I whispered. "You both did." For months after the trial, our family name had been dragged across every headline, every whispering dinner table in town. But time has a way of softening scandal when there's good left in its wake. The Ruth Hayes Hospice Foundation had become something real, and working there changed me. We'd helped 47 patients in our first year, providing care for families who couldn't afford a single night of hospital fees. Each time a mother held her child's hand through their final breath, I felt like Grandma was there, calm, graceful, unafraid. Some days I'd still catch myself expecting Grandpa's voice, that low, unwavering tone saying, "The law can punish the crime, but only truth heals the wound." He was right. Because truth hadn't just healed this family, it had remade it. Dad kept his distance for a while. His probation required him to work with community outreach, ironically under the same foundation that bore Grandma's name. I didn't know if that was justice or poetry. Maybe both. Then, one afternoon, an envelope arrived at my office. No return address. Inside was a handwritten note on plain paper. "Emily, I watched the Foundation's anniversary on TV. You looked so much like your grandmother. I'm proud of you. Maybe Dad was right, some things need to die for others to live." "Dad," I read it twice, then pressed it against my heart. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. That evening, I drove to the lake cabin, the one Grandpa left me. The water was still, painted gold by sunset. His old rocking chair creaked in the wind like it was waiting. I sat there, closing my eyes, listening to the soft hum of cicadas. For the first time since the funeral, I felt peace, not the empty kind that comes from forgetting, but the full, aching kind that comes from finally understanding. I looked up at the darkening sky and whispered, "You were right, Grandpa. You weren't walking away from death that day. You were walking toward the truth. And maybe that's all any of us can do, walk toward it even when it burns. Because in the end, love doesn't survive by staying quiet. It survives by being honest. Sometimes the one who walks away from a funeral isn't escaping grief, they're carrying justice with them.